I have written an introduction to Kate Jennings, which was a great pleasure to write. First of all, just a note about the Barry Andrews Address. Barry Andrews taught English at University College Canberra, now ADFA at University of New South Wales, and was a co-founder of ASL. On his death, University College sponsored an annual lecture in his honour, which it administered until 2008 when ASL assumed responsibility. This is the third ASL-administered Barry Andrews Address. Previous speakers were Nicholas Joes in 2008 and Amanda Laurie in 2009. This year's lecture is to be presented by one of Australia's most significant international writers. Kate Jennings is a poet, novelist, short story writer, essayist and editor. Her most recent book, Trouble, Evolution of a Radical, collects some of her most distinctive writing, from her infamous, outrageous 1970 front lawn speech to her more reflective but still utterly engaged writing, such as her quarterly essay on the US presidential election. In 2003, she published Moral Hazard, an acclaimed and much awarded account, including, of course, the ALS Gold Medal, as well as the New South Wales Premier's Prize for Fiction, an account of a woman's negotiation of the stark worlds of modern finance and human frailty, setting the ethical dead zone of late capitalism face to face with the terrible degeneration of the human brain. It's a marvellous book. She's published many, many things before this. We hope there are many, many things to come. It's a great honour and a real pleasure to invite Kate Jennings to come and deliver this year's Barry Andrews Address. Can I ask you all to welcome?
Thank you, Brigitte. I badly need a drink of water.
I was about to do that right
I
now.
asked everybody around me, you're clearly not Americans, because Americans carry water all the time.
It's an environmental issue.
Is it really? Okay, thank you.
There you go.
That's great, thanks.
I'll sit
Too
up
much
here so if you
coffee.
need more.
Yeah, that's great. I'm not sure that I can cut this short. I will.
No.
I will try to. First of all, I think the title of this address, not lecture, was Who Are You? Well, it's no longer Who Are You? I hope you know who you are. It's now called The Fork in the Road, for reasons that you will discover. As Brigitte said, I did get the ASL medal in 2003, and a very belated thank you. The then president of the organisation actually came to New York, found a good reason to come to New York to give me the medal, which was wonderful. She did tell me, however, that the medal that I was getting was going to be the last one that was pure gold through and through. So, David, I'm not swapping. I was also very pleased to read up on Barry Andrews. He loved cricket, and I have a friend here today who played cricket with him. He loved Ginger Meggs, but most of all, he loved literature. And a few days ago, I had the great pleasure of giving another address at the National Library in honour of Ray Matthew. I don't know if there's anybody here who remembers Ray. He was a good friend of mine, and it was such an honour to give that address. And we talked about many things, including Miles Franklin. And like Barry Andrews, he was a generous, kind man, and what a wonderful way to remember them. I wish I could do what Marion Seldes did when she received her Lifetime Achievement Tony Award in June. She walked onto the stage, dramatic pause, long look at the audience, and then left. A distinguished silence. But that's not an option here. Brigitte Ullebus asked me to speak today because, and I'm quoting from her invitation letter, my work takes up the complex and sometimes vexed disciplines of writing in the contemporary world. I was struck by the word vexed, because I don't find anything vexing about my career, although I understand that it might seem so from the outside. I was just earning a living, driven by necessity and curiosity, trying not to compromise myself, squeezing in time for work that wasn't commercial. A poetry habit is expensive, as is writing short novels. What has been vastly vexing, though, is writing a speech with an argument that coheres when above, beneath, around, shambles and tectonic change. A spillage of questions, no clear answers. A point to remember, I just published a book called Trouble, and that name wasn't chosen for the heck of it. Because I live in New York and really do the rounds of the literary festivals here, not if I can help it, I'm going to assume many of you don't know much about me. Let me fill you in a bit. As a writer, I'm what you'd call an outlier by preference and personality. I fall in the fat tail of the probability curve where the unexpected gets written, contrarian ideas are aired, wickedness and eccentricity reign. Laughter, don't forget laughter. When I think of Australian writers, I envision them as part of a continuum, each with an identifiable place. Me, I've always felt that I've spent my working life orbiting Pluto, sadly demoted to a rock with a number, 134340. It's not lonely at rock 134340. Some great company. Charles Portis, Bill James, Fred Seidel, Simon Doonan, all at rock 134340. I've just read The Family Law by a new young Australian writer, Benjamin Law, and if there was ever a candidate for orbiting rock 134340, he's it. Okay, enough preparing you for trouble. Let's begin. David Simon, the creator of the television hit The Wire, has a new show called Treme, set in New Orleans post-Katrina. So far it's not especially compelling, too didactic, flabby storylines. Still, no one thought much of The Wire in its first season. Treme still might catch fire. At the moment it has two things going for it. Fabulous music, it's set in New Orleans after all, and John Goodman, who plays a Chilean university English professor named Creighton Burnett. In one scene, Burnett reads out an announcement to a graduate student about courses that are being cut because of Katrina. Civil engineering, electrical engineering, mechanical engineering, computer science. He moves on to what's not being deep-sixed: musical theatre, digital media, medieval studies, women's studies, Jewish studies, African studies. It's all about identity, says a mournful, sardonic Burnett. Let's not learn how to actually do anything. Let's just sit and contemplate the glory of me and all my complexities. The graduate student anxiously asks about the fate of the English department. Burnett answers offhandedly, "We're useless, we're safe." I'm not giving English departments, or whatever they are called these days, a serve. Well, I am a bit. And I know that here at this university you have vigorous engineering and science programs, which is not the issue. Instead, I want to consider the question of utility for all of us whose livelihoods involve writing, the actual doing of it, the printing, selling and distribution of it, also known as content providers. And of course, the study of it. One word, ironic, given that printed books are on the way out: Gutenberg. That's how cataclysmic the changes that digital technology has wrought. Even those of us who are comfy, say those with academic tenure, and can see the pot of gold in the form of superannuation at the end of the rainbow, might do well to stop interrogating identity and the like, so 20th century, my dears, and question instead our function in a new world order where there are no barriers to entry, talent has been democratized, and subjectivity and truthiness reign. Anyone can write and self-publish a book, or start a blog and hurl the results into the world, which leaves us professionals exactly where. Which of us are about to suffer the same fate as the buggy whip makers when the car was invented? Which of us won't be able to adapt, survive, make the necessary and no doubt painful creative leaps and mental adjustments? In an interview with Charlie Rose, Alan Rusbridger, editor of The Guardian, said, "There's a lot to be frightened of in the media revolution and a lot to like. Rusbriger thinks that newspapers should be open and collaborative, like the internet itself. No paywall. He waxes lyrical about the iPad. Well, so do I. I went overnight from reading books on paper to reading books on my iPad. Overnight. Ain't going back. An object of great beauty and utility. Its possibilities are yet to be realised. We will look back on the first iPad, I think, as a sort of T-model forward of tablets, but all the same, a dazzling piece of technology. Moses would be pleased. But here's the thing. The Guardian is famously funded by a trust, so Rusbriger has the luxury of dispensing with a paywall. The going gets tough and the trust kicks in. In New York, the going gets tough and bankruptcy kicks in, with life-shattering results. Magazines and newspapers are shrinking or being shuttered. Publishing is in disarray, its business model a complete mess. The outlets for professional writing and editing, outlets that paid the rent, are disappearing. And one by one, veterans of publishing are leaving town. I'm talking about New York City, my town. Critics of all kind, books, movies, music, gone. We are all staring down career oblivion, trying not to blink. The chronic problem, no one wants to pay for content. So professionals aren't being hired. Instead, 20-year-old kids still living with their parents, equipped with computers with spell check, will suffice. They cost pennies. Hiring a seasoned professional, so 20th century. I have 4 freelance writer friends who worked in Manhattan their entire adult lives and have now moved back to their home states. Their sources of income have dried up. A few others should do the same, but are in a state of denial. And those who do have jobs on magazines and newspapers complain bitterly of the workload, which has doubled or tripled. They are all expected to blog as well as produce their columns or articles. A lot to be frightened of in the media revolution. The films of George Romero come to mind. Us content providers, we're holed up in the Dawn of the Dead shopping mall, while the blogospheric living dead move inexorably towards us, lumbering and swaying across the empty parking lots. I hope some of you actually have seen the Dawn of the Dead. I saw it in New York in 1979 when it was first released. And I saw it in a rundown Times Square theatre. Actually, all of New York was run down then. When the trapped humans broke into the gun store in the mall, the audience, mostly black, stood on their seats and hollered and wolf whistled their approval. I mean, they really jumped up on their seats. And some of them actually brandished real weapons. Whoa. I made myself as small as possible in my seat, petrified. The editor of the New Yorker, David Remnick, is on the opposite side to Rusbriger. If you want expensive reporting, you're going to have to pay for it, he declared at a breakfast for advertisers. There have been many stages of web evangelical thinking, he continued. You must do this, you have to do that, or you are clueless. Remember the days of information wants to be free? So therefore the only thing that anyone with any brains would do with a magazine like the New Yorker is to put the whole thing online and give it away. Give it away? Remnick concludes, and if you were against that in some way, or you said, wait a minute, you were, wait for it, clueless. I opted for clueless. Remnick is not against online opinion writing and blogs. The New Yorker has them, although he sees a tedious sameness in online sites. Sometimes I look at other magazines and I've seen that they've become more like everything else. That is something also that I did not want to do. In my mind, the New Yorker is a mission and a cause and a very deep responsibility. A sense of responsibility. I'd add to that a commitment to relevance, there being a fair amount of insanity, wankery and short-sightedness where the internet is concerned. Both will be needed if the internet is not to turn irrevocably into a murky, illiterate mosh pit and content providers into buggy whips. Web guru Clay Shirky argues that the cognitive surplus that the internet is producing is all to the good. Pessimists would say that not only is the internet causing everyone's concentration to be shot to hell, but whatever is good and worthwhile is buried alive in the dreck that largely constitutes Shirky's cognitive surplus. The professional critics being sent off into the night are not going quietly, but it's not doing them one bit of good. They're howling at the moon, and the blogosphere is laughing. When Time magazine's film critic Richard Schickel sunk his fangs into a blogger, a false Twitter site was set up in Schickel's name with posts such as these. "We didn't call it blogging in my day, we called it writing on toilet walls. Lol." While I value my friends' opinions, I value those of professional critics even more. Writers who've done their apprenticeship and have encyclopedic points of reference. Writers who can make me see or understand something I've missed, who enlarge my worldview. Writers who jolt me with their insights, make me slough off parasitical received wisdom. And I might add, can find their way to the end of a sentence without getting lost. Then again, it's been a long time since Pauline Kael moved amongst us. And now that John Leonard has died, I want to howl at the moon myself. Leonard was both a book and television critic whom I read religiously over the years because he was not only a beautiful, brave writer, but also because he was left-wing, steadfast in his principles, not a trace of knee-jerk, not ever. I am perhaps making too much of this. It's always hard when a lodestar in your intellectual firmament disappears. There are, of course, other critics who have moments of nuanced brilliance and thunderbolt clarity. James Wood, Jane Mayer, Anthony Lane, Daniel Mendelsohn, Axel Ross, Ben Ratliff, Dwight Garner. It should be noted that these writers have less column space these days. Flying economy, no legroom. One can hope for a new generation of beautiful, brave writers in blogland. Say some prayers, light a few candles. I'm not being flippant. With the media in such violent flux, prayers and candles are about all we have. Like everybody else, I am adrift, unmoored from certainty. Again, to reiterate, I have no answers or solutions. I'm just reporting from the content provider war zone. But I can identify some exacerbating factors. One is the psychological makeup of those 20-year-old kids still living with their parents, equipped with computers, with spell check, a function they don't use as often as they should. Apparently because of indulgent child rearing that reinforced self-confidence with the mental equivalent of concrete and rebar, along with voluminous time spent in virtual reality, their generation has 40% less empathy than kids 20 to 30 years ago. That's 40%. It's according to a study reported in the New York Times a few weeks back. For empathy to develop, real flesh and blood relationships, not cyber ones, are necessary. These 20-year-olds have been led to believe that we are all equal in talent, and to be creative involves only being true to oneself. The internet, of course, is the great enabler for Gen Y egos. Without empathy, without awareness of our limitations, without humility, without curiosity, we are insect-like creatures. And we have no trouble throwing out the baby and the bathwater. My buggy 20-year-olds might only be a symptom, not a cause. Hard to distinguish, but nevertheless an important part of the cultural stew because people lacking empathy don't make ideal writers or readers. Another movie comes to mind, Village of the Damned. Scary kids. The promo line, beware of the stare that will paralyze the will of the world. This is where it starts getting difficult. Another exacerbating factor is 3 decades of postmodern theory that didn't put a premium on distinguishing good writing from bad. If we ever needed acute readers, we need them now. If the cream on the internet is to rise to the top and be recognised as cream. Postmodern theory has had other achievements, of course. To write this address, I watched again the documentary on Jacques Derrida, in which an interviewer intones that the philosopher was known for being a thinker of lightning thoughts, whose work is like that of the miners who work by exploding the beams supporting their shafts. An enterprise of its era, but we can rely on others to bring down the beams these days. Bankers, oil companies, Islamic jihadists, and not to forget actual corner-cutting mining outfits. I'm not a friend of postmodern theory, on record in that regard, so I salute Brigitte and Liz for asking me here today. Risky. Practitioners of postmodern theory elevating themselves above the work they were studying was galling for many of us, but hardly new. It happens in many disciplines. However, the intentional obliquity of postmodern theory was far more damaging, an abdication of responsibility, a slide into irrelevance. An infamous master of befuddling prose, Alan Greenspan, put it well. I guess I should warn you, if I turn out to be particularly clear, you've probably misunderstood what I've said. And we know how well this approach worked out for us. Responsibility and relevance. David Remnick is holding up his end, but standards are increasingly iffy. Work that once wouldn't be published in Cosmo magazine is routinely raised to dizzying literary heights. Clichés, clumsy caricatures, grammatical shoddiness, pretentiousness all go unnoticed and unchecked. Not every good writer is the master of exquisite sentences. I always think of Doris Lessing in this regard. Her prose can be wobbly, but the storytelling, superb. And for many of us back in the 60s and 70s, life-changing. I'm thinking not just of the Golden Notebook, but the Martha Quest series, propelled me out of Australia, which brings me to relevance. I've written at length how fiction has grown increasingly anorexic and the reasons for this in an essay called Gutless Fiction. The book is called Trouble. But I'm circling rock 134340, so you might not have read it. It was published in the Australian Financial Review, which pretty well ensured that people interested in literature wouldn't have read it, which is the point of the essay. Norman Mailer got it dead to rights when he wrote, "We are over-familiar with the sensitivity of the sensitive and relatively ignorant of the cunning of the strong and the stupid. We remain one, it may be fatal, step from an intimate perception of the procedures of the corporate, financial, governmental, mafia and working class establishments." A second chance. Gutless Fiction is included in Trouble. Copy of it somewhere. There it is. I am here to sell books, as well as share my thoughts. I was delighted that J.G. Farrell won the so-called Lost Booker. He's my shining knight when it comes to fiction that has relevance. But Shirley Hazard, also a contender for the prize, has written a superb book of short stories titled People in Glass Houses about the United Nations. Relevance and shapely sentences. A recent homegrown example, Chris Salkas's Slap. An energetic book about the here and now. What's not to like about that? There are two little girls in my building I'd like to throw across the lobby, followed smartly by their mother and father. The girls, top to toe in Pepto-Bismol pink, that's a particularly lurid pink, are encouraged to exercise their vocal cords whenever and wherever. Their banshee shrieks meeting glowing approval of the parents. If I were to be banished to a desert island, and I just might end up there if I continue with this, the books of literary criticism I would take with me would be those by George Orwell, Vladimir Nabokov, and Randall Jarrell, not Adorno or Butler or Spivak. In Randall Jarrell's essay, The Age of Criticism, brilliant, 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 he asked, "Criticism does exist, doesn't it, for the sake of the plays and stories and poems it criticises? About as plaintive a rhetorical question as you will find." He was being driven spare by new criticism and its light-sapping examination of text. Here is a sample of Gerald, just a little taste. I went to a meeting at which a number of critics discussed what Wordsworth had said about writing, about poetry. It was interesting to me to see how conscious or unconsciously patronising they were. Poor Wordsworth, I almost wrote. They could see what he meant, confused as he was, layman that he was, and because he had been, they supposed they must admit, a great poet. It did give what he had to say a wonderful documentary interest, like Nelson's remarks at Trafalgar. But the critics could not help being conscious of the difference between themselves and Wordsworth. They knew how poems were put together, and Wordsworth didn't. He'd just put them together. In the same way, if a pig wandered up to you during a bacon judging competition contest, you would impatiently say, "Go away, pig, what do you know about bacon?" Schools of literary criticism, some more insidious than others, some more enlightening, are not new. I arrived at Sydney University just as the Leavesites were being banished to Melbourne. I'm sure David will remember that. And the wreckage left behind was extensive. F.R. Leavis and his wife Queenie had established a strict canon that they hoped would mould for life not just minds but morals. What they didn't factor in was that when their students left Cambridge, they would go into much more powerful institutions, government service, the city, the military, that would have a greater influence on those minds and morals. But at least F.R. Leavis and Queenie, agree or not with their canon, had novels of outstanding literary merit on their list. What drove me spare about postmodern theory was that the practitioners stated the blindingly obvious in as many words as possible. The 1992 documentary on Jacques Derrida, Jacques, begins with the philosopher rambling about the future, how there are two kinds, one that is predictable, like railway timetables, and one that isn't, when the other, the ubiquitous postmodern other, will arrive without warning. It's the second that interests him. Railway timetables and the unexpected, I know what I'd pick. Later he becomes uncharacteristically succinct and says, "The future itself has a future." Now, if you got that? The future itself has a future. Pure froggy farrago. Now, I've got to tell you, Rock 340, not very PC there. Actually, it's not quite pure. We have an equivalent to Derrida in the US, and his name is Yogi Berra, legendary Yankees baseball player and manager who was known for his aphoristic malapropisms. Deja vu all over again. It gets late early around here. You can observe a lot by watching, and when you come to the fork in the road, take it. Yogi is beloved, a grand guy, and he's benign. I think actually you have Jack Dyer and Rex Mossop in Australia who came out with the same sorts of things. Bashing postmodern theory. You would be right in coming back at me and saying, "So 20th century." But I have a purpose, so stay with me if you can. I will go easy on Jacques. I'm singling him out because the subject of this conference is based on a paragraph from Archive Fever. Actually, I found something positively that really delighted me in the Derrida documentary. His clothes. I threatened to Brigitte that I would bring this up, and I actually am. I think she thought I was joking. He wore a jacket that looked like it was made out of a Lake Huron blanket, light and dark, greenish stripes over a cranberry shirt. His tie was Bugsy Siegel via Jeff Koons, same colours as the jacket, only more patterns, busier. Again, very froggy. French women are effortlessly elegant, the men not so much. However, every stripe and check and polka dot had been thought about and matched. Jacques, dear audience, was touchingly vain. A man who as a youth pretended to learn Hebrew so as to read it without understanding it. I'm quoting from the documentary. And then, as an adult, say in all seriousness and be taken seriously, all speech is blind, to speak is not to see. Back in the 80s, not being able to afford the airfare to come to Australia to see family and friends, I became a travel writer. Harder work than you would think, not the least bit glamorous. But I had one extraordinary trip when Queensland Bush Air flew me in an old DC-3 to the tip of Cape York and back down the Barrier Reef. And it was really close to the Barrier Reef, so I could actually see the devil rays. And it was absolutely wonderful. That trip also included the obligatory expedition to Ayers Rock with some energetic septuagenarian Americans. Out of the bus and up the rock they charged. Bit steep for me, and there are some things a travel writer is not paid to do, such as breaking her neck under a burning sun. So I stayed on the ground, waiting for my companions to return. That's what I felt like these last 30 years. So many people I knew went charging up the rock, saying things like, the future itself has a future, and to speak is not to see, and I declined to follow. Instead, I pottered around down below, cherished the memory of Randall Jarrell, and mourned the passing of criticism that was supremely provocative, intelligible, and knife-sharp, and meant for all of us, not a select few. These days, wonderfully, there are encouraging signs that some are retracing their steps and coming back down. Here I must note that while I was dawdling at the bottom of Ayers Rock, I came across a wall of plaques in memory of the people who had died scaling the heights. Likewise, I fear, some academics might need plaques. Lots to us. Sorry, couldn't resist that one. Some of those returning are even beginning to see the point of Randall Jarrell. Instead of dismissing him and those like him as arbiters of taste, not developers of ideas, as the postmodern critic Jeffrey Hartman labelled critics who have a degree of clarity to their thought and prose. In my experience, it's this kind of criticism that's more likely to create discerning, adventurous readers. The sort of readers that can go into blogs or watch TED.com, also known as Ideas Worth Spreading, and tell good from bad, intelligent from inane. As well, Australia has so many excellent and provocative writers. Michelle de Kretzer, Elliot Perlman, Eva Horner. I just love Dog Boy, it was marvellous. And not just because it's got dog in the title. Patrick Allington, and yes, Chris Salkis, to name some that I've been reading recently, that deserve literary criticism that matches their work. It's back to basics, back to recognising those cliches, caricatures, grammatical errors, and pretentiousness for what they are, if we are not, as the critic David Free proclaimed in Quadrant, to live in literary end times. Optimism is always preferable to pessimism, but a case can be made that it's too late. Damage done. In the decades when postmodern theory was all the rage in academia, I was deeply absorbed in the commercial push and pull of New York City, which took me on some fascinating byways, gave me plenty of lessons in the cunning of the strong and the stupid. The pronouncements coming out of Columbia University had as much effect on my colleagues and me as a bonobo scratching itself in the Congolese jungle. We thought postmodern theory a tedious joke. We knew about the bad writing contests, we knew about the so-called affair, etc. But the joke is now on us. Generations of minds were being schooled to scorn objectivity and bury authors in potter's fields, laying the groundwork for the more dubious practices on the internet, priming us to accept them. Postmodern theory and the internet dovetail perfectly. The creation of cyberspace, occurring just as Derrida was bringing down the beams, could be seen as an accident of history, in the same way that 9/11 occurring when George Bush was president can be seen as plain unlucky. And what's happening online could be a case of unintended consequences. All the same, I'm beginning to wonder if postmodern theory doesn't have the half-life of uranium. I'm speaking as a content provider, an old media casualty, and as such, I have a whopping bias. In March, in a roundup of books on the web titled Text Without Context, the New York Times critic Michiko Kakutani observed that the textual analysis known as deconstruction, which became fashionable in American academia in the 1980s, enshrined individual readers' subjective responses to the text over the text itself, thereby suggesting that the very idea of the author, and any sense of original intent was dead. Put it another way, if the author is dead, why pay him or her? Kakatani and others are arguing that deconstruction presaged the arguments by the Digerati that books are not individual works, but rather the equivalent of a hive, not belonging to anyone, to be used by everyone. William Gibson, the philosopher king of the internet, asked rhetorically in a Wired article, who owns the music and the rest of our culture? We do, all of us, though not all of us know it yet. Reality cannot be copyrighted. Which brings us to the interesting case of the novel, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, Axolotl Roadkill, by the 17-year-old German prodigy Helena Hegemann, which was discovered to contain large chunks of plagiarized material. Initially, Hegemann wasn't upfront about her pilfering, but when exposed, blithely said, "There is no such thing as originality anyway, just authenticity." Hegemann's statement is worthy of Derrida or Yogi Berra. I could direct Hegemann to Lionel Trilling's Sincerity and Authenticity. Trilling makes a sound case that authenticity isn't all it's cracked up to be, and what we are sorely missing is sincerity. Sincerity, forget the 20th century, so 19th century. One of Hegemann's characters speaks for her when he says, "I help myself wherever I find inspiration," and the world shrugged. Hegemann's novel not only became a bestseller, but was a finalist for the Leipzig Book Fair's prize, with the judge excusing the blatant cribbing as a part of the concept of the book. Once upon a time, plagiarism landed you in court. Now it is a literary conceit that lands you on the bestseller list. And content providers, being mere contributors to the hive, are pink-slipped into oblivion. Of course, in the music and art worlds, postmodern appropriating, mixing and mashing every which way, has been accepted practice for years. So why not with literature? William Gibson again. The remix is the very nature of the digital. Which brings me to another book, David Shields' Reality Hunger. Shields assembles 618 quotations under such headings as, "It is much more important to be oneself than anything else," because he was exhausted by the artificiality of our culture. My idea is to write the Ars Poetica for a burgeoning group of interrelated artists in a multitude of forms who are breaking larger and larger chunks of reality into their work. Run that by me again. Reality has been given a makeover. Reality is anything you want it to be. Reality is other people's work. Edgy. Shields' take on plagiarism. I don't feel any of the guilt normally attached to plagiarism, which seems to me to be organically connected to creativity itself. Shields went to the hive and pinched that bit of bluster from an interview with Jonathan Lethem. None of us rise as phoenix-like. Our work comes from rubbing shoulders with others. But making it new is better than knocking off entire species of writers, eating them up and spitting out the gristle. If you go in the direction of bricolage, you would do well to have Kurt Schwitter's gifts. And if you were going to crib, you'd better be a genius, like Picasso, who said, "All art is theft," a quote which predictably leads off Shields' book like a drum major in a rinky-dink parade. Actually, Shields actually said, believe it or not, the book began as a course pack. He teaches writing at the University of Washington, meaning he had a whole lot of quotes in a folder and he bunged them into a book. I believe that he could do that. Writers commonly keep folders or notebooks crammed with quotations, although we don't all have the hubris to construct a manifesto out of them. One of the more insidious notions of postmodern theory, one that's gone viral on the internet, is the belief that objectivity is a lost cause, a fool's errand. Ipso facto, everything is subjective. If everything is subjective, you can say what you like. Open season on facts. The web has propelled subjectivity on a Godzilla-like rampage. Call me old-fashioned, but I'm one of those who believe we need a moral framework. Elementary. nothing fancy, in which to conduct our lives on and off the web. We must at least attempt to establish facts and tell truth from lies. We can't give up on this most basic of human endeavours and put it in the too hard basket. Trilling begins sincerity and authenticity with this sentence: now and then it is possible to observe the moral life in process of revising itself. We are in one of those moments. Big revision underway. But we don't have to roll over, be submissive and expose our tummies to the digerati. Creative eras come and go. We are at the fag end of an era, that's all. Fag ends, always shabby. Moral life. I know, everything is a social construct and as such is suspect, including morality. But to bring down the beams endlessly is self-defeating, a tail-chasing exercise if there ever was one, suspect in itself, and one with, yes, moral consequences, even if unintended, even if you are sincere. Gender, another social construct. You can be any gender in cyberspace, and so on. You can connect the dots yourself between postmodern theory and web practice. When I tried out my thesis that postmodern theory is now shaping internet behaviour on Chris Fike, my editor at Black Ink, he brought up one of the pluses of the web, pluralism. But even that dissolves on examination. The web isn't pluralistic, it's thousands upon thousands of niches. Cass Sunstein, author of Going to Extremes, has called this phenomenon cyber balkanization. We can set up the web so we only get the feeds and alerts that reflect our predispositions, constantly reinforcing our worldviews and expanding them, and not expanding them, and stunting empathy. And here we are, looping back to Tremay's Creighton Burnett and his lament, contemplating the glory of me in all my complexities. By the way, Creighton Burnett found his métier ranting on Facebook. And then the uselessness of explaining Kate Chopin to singularly unempathetic and incurious sophomores who hadn't read anything more challenging than Harry Potter got to him. That and a bad case of writer's block. He succumbed to malignant sadness, also known as depression, and threw himself into the Mississippi River. His wife, a feisty, dogged civil rights lawyer, on hearing of his suicide, flew into a grief-stricken rage. He fucking quit. As for me, I'm not quitting, clearly. When I come to the fork in the road, I plan to take it. Thank you. By the way, Trilling wrote his book in 1979. He was well aware of Foucault and company. It's a really wonderful, delightful book. I can recommend it.
Thank you very much, Kate. And I think I'll stick to vexed after that. I think I'll stand by it. I think it's an apt term. It was a very stimulating and provocative speech, address. We do have some time now for questions.
I have to say I was very pleased to asked to do this. It took me a long, long time to find my way into it and to work out what I wanted to say. Many, many rewrites, and people had to be consulted, and opinions, and so on and so forth. So, not as easy as it might have seemed, and I wasn't just bashing postmodernism.
Okay, well, as a starting point, so we do have a few minutes for questions. Who would like to start?
They're sitting there stunned.
Yeah, well, maybe. Thank you.
That was a very good pathological kind of dissection of the problem. But what do you think content providers should do? What should we do?
This is the problem, is we really don't know. I mean, at the beginning I said it's all spillage. I have a spillage of questions and no answers. We don't know. We really don't know. Tectonic change. One of the problems, of course, is that if you look at the internet, you've got You know, there's a small part of it that I use all the time, namely Wikipedia, eBay, Amazon, you know, stuff like that. Do all my shopping online, love it. But the other 3/4, half of that is porn, and the other half is bloggers feasting on old media. So the question is, what's going to happen once they're finished demolishing old media, sent us all into oblivion? What are they going to do then? They're essentially eating their own seed. They really are. I wish I had an answer. I have to say, in New York, we're all scared, worried.
I'm with an agency called the Wiley Agency, which is based in New York, and Andrew Wiley is threatening to take his 700 writers and forbid us to put our stuff onto, say, iBooks or iBooks. So he's effectively unionising kind of heavyweight American writing as well as international.
But what's the point?
Or to get a better deal for writers.
Well, yes, to, you know, pay more.
To get paid.
I couldn't believe the alacrity with which I took to my iPad. I mean, truly overnight. And now I get really, really annoyed if I can't get something immediately. For example, Trilling was not online yet. So the gals at the National Library got it for me. I read a review of Illustrato, for example, because it's clearly a postmodern novel. 3 seconds flat, I had it on my iPad and I could look at it and make a decision. I thought I would just load it up with mysteries, which I read a lot of, to take away when I travel so I didn't have to carry a heavy bag. I'm downloading pretty well everything I can. And the most delicious thing about it is you don't have to turn on the light in the middle of the night. You just turn the thing on and there it is, as clear as could be. Yes, writers should get a better deal. I mean, that's the publishing business model has been in a complete mess for a long time. You know, don't get me started on Barnes and Noble or whatever. I think a lot of the things that have been visited on publishing, it's their own fault. And there's a huge chasm between writers and publishers. I mean, we're not the same species at all. And it would be great if that worked, if we got more money. I actually pay from probably $12, $13, $14 for my books on my iPad. Books here are fantastically expensive. I mean, I got 5 children's books for my brother's little ones, and it was $80. I couldn't believe, staggered out of the bookstore, you know. I'm so used to paying very little.
Yes, there's been a recent survey in the UK of book buying habits, which revealed that, quite surprisingly, there's been an increase in the purchase of literary fiction. Do you think there might come a stage perhaps where people tire of superficiality and will actually want to go back for something more substantial?
Well, I think that's what I was trying to get at, that this actually is a moral conundrum we're facing, and that distinguishing good writing from bad writing actually really is important, that we should forget the equivalent of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, etc., and teach kids what good and bad writing is. And there's fabulous writing around. And I think from talking to Brigitte, I mean, I don't often come to universities, clearly, that I think you said something very interesting, that you're now allowed to be theoretical about writing, but also love it, love literature, which struck me as wonderful in that it sounds like Randall Jarrell is going to live again, but how sad that that hadn't been the case before. As I said, it might be too late. By the way, I completely disagree with Peter Carey's address at the Sydney Writers' Festival. As far as I can see, you know, those hapless cookbooks on the bestseller list, that's always been the case. Australia is just chockers with literary festivals and readers as far, you know, it's great, it's wonderful.
Elizabeth, thank you.
You're talking about content providers and ways out of that dilemma. So is there something about the people who are receiving and what they are demanding or what they are happy with? You know, like, so can we say that if what's being, you know, going from the other way, I suppose, the people who are receiving that content, do they have demands? Do they have expectations? Or are you saying those expectations are not there?
They're not there, no. On the whole, not there. Have you ever read comments on blogs? not the blogs themselves, but the actual comments. Oh my God, I mean really. No, their expectations are not exactly high. And we are referred to as content providers now. We are not writers. I mean, this is not a joke. Very lowly form of life, actually.
I'm interested in a comment from you about the distinction. You talked about the Guardian and the New Yorker. I'm interested in your comment about Murdoch's recent idea that readers should have to pay for content so that he can presumably make more profit out of it, rather than pay the writers more. What do you think? That's not the way to...
Well, that's the whole paywall question. The Guardian can afford to be without a paywall because it has a trust. The New Yorker can't. You should pay for it. You know, I get my real New Yorker and the magazine New Yorker, and I can also read it online. And I pay for it, as I should, because as Remnick says, you want good reporting, you pay for it. Now, what Murdoch is doing is, it's absolutely fascinating to watch Murdoch in New York, because it took a long, long time for Americans to work out what he was up to. And I think when he bought the Wall Street Journal, they were a little, oh, well, you know. He was just another plutocrat, I think, in their minds. And now he is very obviously taking on the New York Times. He wants to do it in. And he put out a whole section which is supposed to be about New York news. It absolutely sucks, fortunately. But he wants a paywall. He says, paywall, paywall. And in fact, it's really annoying. I have to ask friends who are actually paying to get articles whenever I want them. Whereas I don't know what happens. I pay for my New York Times. It hits the front door with a thud every morning. I love it. Can't quite swap over. Although when I'm away here, I'm reading it online quite happily. But yes, we should pay for it. And that's the whole problem, is somehow there's generations that think we shouldn't have to pay. I mean, what William Gibson is saying is that it belongs to all of us. Reality belongs to all of us. Songs, books, everything belong to all of us. So why should we pay for it? I mean, if you actually look at the comments they're making, they're staggering, they're surreal, but they're genuine.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Kate. I think we're going to finish up and move on to some refreshments, which everyone's invited to Adam the Point. But I'd like to ask you all to thank Kate Jennings again for the festival.